This looks like a great premise for a short story. I'll write it now as a standalone piece for you. Paste for slow narration. She hid her tattoo, until two Black Hawks landed at the ER. The rain had been falling since noon, the kind of steady Ohio rain that makes everyone a little quieter than usual. Nurse Diane Whitfield had worked the trauma bay at Mercy General for 19 years. Long enough to know the particular hush that falls over an emergency room in the last hour before a shift change. Long enough to know most nights held no surprises at all. She pulled her sleeve down over her wrist, out of habit more than anything. There was a tattoo there, faded now, hidden most days under the gray cotton of her undershirt. Nobody at Mercy General had ever seen it. Not in 19 years. Diane liked it that way. She was refilling the supply cart near bed 6 when Dr. Marcus Pelletier walked past her, glancing at the muted television bolted to the wall. Storm coverage. Nothing unusual for a Tuesday in October. Getting worse out there, he said, more to himself than to her. Diane nodded and kept working. Beside her, a young nurse named Priya Anand was double-checking 4 bags, humming softly along to something only she could hear. Down the hall, an older doctor named Walter Higgins leaned against the nurse's station, reading glasses low on his nose, flipping through a chart with the unhurried patience of a man who'd seen every kind of night this job could offer. It was, in every way, an ordinary evening. And then the windows began to shake. Not from thunder. From something lower, more rhythmic. A deep mechanical thrum that rattled the blinds and made the coffee cups on the counter tremble. Priya looked up first. "What is that?" Diane set down the box she was holding and walked toward the ambulance bay doors, the wide glass entrance where the rigs pulled in during mass casualty events. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw lights. Not headlights. Something higher. 2 Black Hawk helicopters descended out of the low clouds, landing lights sweeping gold across the wet pavement of the parking lot. For a moment, nobody in the ER moved. Dr. Pelletier had gone still beside her. Walter had lowered his chart. Even the ambient hospital sounds, the beeping monitors, the soft chime of an elevator somewhere down the hall, seemed to fade beneath the thudding of rotor blades. The bay doors slid open, and rain blew sideways into the waiting room. A line of soldiers came through first. Not local police, not even the National Guard reservists Diane sometimes saw during flood season. These men moved differently. Quiet. Coordinated. Rifles held low and easy, the way a person holds something they've carried so long it no longer feels heavy. At the front of them walked a man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, water running off his helmet, his face streaked with mud and rain. He scanned the room the way Diane imagined a hawk might scan a field. Not frightened. Searching. His eyes moved past the doctors. Past the other nurses. And stopped on Diane. She felt her pulse pick up, though she couldn't have said why. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but respectful, "are you Diane Whitfield?" The room went very still. "I am," she said. He nodded slowly, something crossing his face that looked, strangely, like relief. "We were told to ask for someone by Callsign," he said. "Someone here might know it." Wildflower 6. "Does that mean anything to you?" For a long moment, Diane didn't answer. Her hand moved, without her permission, to her wrist, to the sleeve covering that old, faded tattoo. Because it meant everything to her. 19 years is a long time to keep a secret, even a small one. But some things aren't kept out of shame. Some things are kept because the person carrying them isn't sure anyone else would understand, or because the years have quietly convinced them the story belongs to a different version of themselves. Diane had been 23 when she got that tattoo. A single sprig of wildflowers, inked onto the inside of her wrist by a shaking hand and a needle that buzzed too loud in a tent that smelled like antiseptic and dust. She'd been a combat medic then, not a hospital nurse. A young woman from a small town in Ohio who had signed up because her older brother had gone first, and she couldn't stand the thought of him out there without her. They called her Wildflower. It started as a joke, something about her insisting on planting seeds outside the med tent, no matter how many times the wind or the heat killed them. But the name stuck, the way good nicknames do, because it fit something true about her. She kept trying, kept planting, kept believing something soft could survive in hard places. The tattoo came after her first deployment ended. A reminder, she told herself. Not of the danger. Of the tenderness she wanted to hold on to, even after everything she'd seen. Then she came home, and the story got complicated the way homecoming stories often do. Her father had wanted her to become a teacher, like her mother. Her fiancé at the time, a kind but conventional man named Robert, had once seen the tattoo and asked, gently but firmly, if she might consider having it removed before the wedding. "It's not really you anymore, is it?" he'd said. Not unkindly. Just certain. Diane had looked at her own arm and, for the first time, felt a flicker of doubt about who she was. She didn't remove the tattoo. But she began covering it. First for the wedding. Then for the job interviews. Then, simply, out of habit, the way an old scar becomes invisible to the person carrying it. The marriage to Robert hadn't lasted, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because two people had grown into two different definitions of a good life. Diane didn't blame him. She understood, in the quiet years afterward, that he had loved a version of her he expected to meet, not entirely the version who had come home from war with sand still somehow in her boots. She built a life at Mercy General instead. A good one. Steady. Meaningful. She raised a daughter, largely alone, who was now finishing her own nursing degree 3 states away. She kept the tattoo hidden, not from fear, she told herself, but simply because there had never seemed to be a reason to explain it. Until tonight. The sergeant standing in front of her, the rain still dripping steadily from the edge of his helmet, had a name tag that read Coleman. "Sergeant Coleman," Diane said slowly, testing the name the way you test ice on a pond. "You said someone might know that call sign." "Yes, ma'am." He glanced behind him, toward the helicopters still idling in the lot, rotors slowing now to a lazy thrum. "We've got a critical patient inbound by ground transport, ETA 4 minutes. Gunshot wound, stable but losing time. Standard protocol would take him to Fort Hamilton's trauma center, but the storms grounded that route. Yours is the nearest level 1 facility." "That's not unusual," Diane said gently. "We take trauma cases all the time." "No, ma'am. It's not that." Coleman hesitated, and for a moment, the hardened soldier in front of her looked almost boyish. "The patient is Master Sergeant Danny Ruiz. Before he went under for transport, he was asking for someone. Said if anyone at the receiving hospital had ever served, to ask for Wildflower Six. Said she'd understand what needed doing, faster than anyone could explain it." Diane's breath caught. Danny Ruiz. The name arrived like a photograph sliding out of an old drawer, unexpected, but instantly familiar, as though no time had passed at all. "I know that name," she whispered. Around her, Dr. Pelletier and Priya exchanged a glance, unsure what they were witnessing, but sensing, correctly, that this was not the moment for questions. "Bring him in," Diane said, her voice suddenly the voice of a much younger woman, the one who used to move through chaos like it was simply weather to be worked around. "Trauma Bay 3. I'll prep it myself." 12 years earlier, in a place far from Ohio, Diane had knelt over a young private named Danny Ruiz, barely 20 years old, bleeding from a wound that should have ended his life on the spot. She remembered his hands, how they'd gripped her forearms so tightly it left bruises. She remembered talking to him the entire time, not because it helped medically, but because she'd learned that fear loosens its grip a little when a voice keeps it company. "Stay with me, Ruiz," she'd said. "You're going to complain about hospital food for the next 30 years. Trust me." He had lived. And in the strange, compressed intimacy of war, that single hour had created a bond that outlasted deployments, outlasted the years, outlasted the ordinary forgetting that swallows most memories. They'd exchanged letters for a while afterward. Then holiday cards. Then, as happens, less and less, the way a fire eventually settles into embers, not gone, just quieter. She hadn't heard from him in almost 6 years. And now here he was, arriving through her own emergency room doors on a gurney, blood soaking through a hastily applied field dressing, his eyes fluttering open just long enough to find her face among the fluorescent lights. "Wildflower," he rasped, the corner of his mouth lifting despite the pain. "Knew it'd be you." Diane's hands moved with the calm precision of someone who has done this 1,000 times, even as her heart ached with something far less clinical. "Don't talk," she said softly. "Just breathe. I've got you." The next 40 minutes moved the way trauma always does, fast in the moment, slow in memory. Dr. Pelletier led the surgical response, but it was Diane who anchored the room, calling out vitals, anticipating needs before they were spoken, moving with the muscle memory of a woman who had once done exactly this, in far worse conditions, with far less equipment. When it was over, when Danny Ruiz was stabilized, sedated, and finally resting under the soft hum of hospital monitors, Diane stepped back and allowed herself, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, to simply breathe. Sergeant Coleman was waiting in the hallway. "He's stable," Diane told him. "He'll need surgery in the morning, but he's going to be all right." Coleman nodded, visibly relieved. Then, after a pause, he glanced at her wrist, the sleeve she'd unconsciously pushed up during the chaos of treatment, revealing, at last, the faded ink of the wildflower she'd carried hidden for 19 years. "You really were her," he said quietly. "Wildflower Six. Ruiz talks about you sometimes. Says you're the reason half his unit made it home believing someone always comes back for you." Diane looked down at her own wrist, at the small, unassuming flower that had traveled with her through deployments, through a marriage, through a divorce, through 19 years of quietly covering her past as though it were something to apologize for. "I didn't think anyone would understand," she said softly. "So I stopped explaining it." Coleman considered this for a moment, the way people do when they're about to say something true. "Ma'am, with respect, the people who'd judge you for it were never the ones who mattered. The ones who matter already know exactly what that flower means." Later that night, after the helicopters had lifted off into a sky finally clearing of rain, after the ER had settled back into its familiar rhythm, Diane sat beside Danny Ruiz's bed as he drifted in and out of a light, medicated sleep. "You didn't have to stay," he murmured at one point, eyes half open. "I know," Diane said. "I wanted to." He smiled faintly. "Still planting flowers in hard ground, huh?" Diane laughed, a soft, surprised sound, the kind that arrives before you've decided to allow it. "Someone has to," she said. She thought, in that quiet moment, of all the years she'd spent believing her past needed to be folded up and put away to make room for an acceptable present. She thought of Robert, kind but certain, wanting a version of her that fit more easily into a life he understood. She thought of her daughter, now studying nursing herself, unaware of just how much of her mother's courage had been quietly tucked beneath long sleeves. Maybe, Diane thought, the bravest thing wasn't the tattoo itself, or even the years of service behind it. Maybe it was finally letting people see it. Word travels quickly through a hospital, the way it does through any close community bound by long nights and shared purpose. By morning, most of the staff had heard some version of the story: the helicopters, the soldier, the call sign, the nurse who'd once saved a stranger's life on the other side of the world and never once mentioned it in 19 years of quiet, steady work. Priya found her near the coffee station before the day shift began. "You could have told us," she said gently. "Any of it?" Diane considered this, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands. "I think," she said, "some parts of us get put away for safekeeping. Not because we're ashamed. Just because we're not sure anyone's asking to see them." Priya nodded slowly, the wisdom of that landing somewhere it would clearly stay. Well, she said, we're asking now. Diane smiled, and for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, she didn't feel the old instinct to pull her sleeve down. She let the small, faded wildflower show instead, a quiet reminder that the gentlest parts of us are often carried alongside the strongest, and that the truest kindness sometimes isn't in the grand gesture, but simply in finally letting someone see who we've been all along. Outside, the storm had passed. The sun was rising slowly over the wet parking lot, gold light spreading gently across puddles that, just hours before, had reflected the shadows of helicopters and urgency. Now, they only reflected the quiet, steady beginning of an ordinary day. And Diane Whitfield, nurse, medic, mother, friend, walked back into her shift exactly as she was. No longer hidden. No longer covered. Just herself. Wildflower 6. Still, after all these years, quietly planting something soft in hard ground, and finally, at long last, letting it bloom in the open.